And to get started today, I'd like to first ask you all, we've got a good crowd today. I see about 40 people. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, your name, organization, and city and state. So just to review before we get started, we've got several future calls coming up at the same time every month, the second Thursday of the month at 10:30 Pacific time. In June, we're going to talk about is being at the table, the joiner side of community engagement. Is being at the table enough? So we're going to look at our roles and our accountability on committees, advisory boards, task forces, work groups, and etc. So what's our expectation and looking at accountability? In July, we will have an update and conversation with the California the DAR program, Disability Disaster Access Resources. And we're going to talk about the role of the centers of California who provide power-dependent people with the resources needed during unplanned and planned power outages. We're going to talk about how that program's working, what the deployments and activations have been like, particularly during the extreme weather California's had, the winter storms, the wildfires, and really look at this important program in terms of lessons that other states might be able to apply. And finally, in August, we're going to look at the issue of hybrid meetings and conferences and look at why are they important? What are some of the accessibility issues? What does it take in terms of budgets and incremental steps to make this real and make it work? And our speakers for that call are Sadie Martinez and Tim Mann from Colorado, and Shaylin Suzelis, the co-executive director from the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies. So for today, on to our focus. Vance, okay to turn your camera on, and thanks for joining us. We know that you're incredibly busy. It's given what's going on with the record-breaking storms in California and the much anticipated effects of the snowmelt. So I'm going to start out with some questions for Vance that I've collected from all of you, and then it'll be your turn to ask questions. So we're looking for your questions in chat. Just begin them with a saying question colon, and then I will look at them and maybe combine some of them, but we will get to your questions. If you're unable to raise your hand during the discussion period, just if you can't use chat, just raise your hand using the raise hand function in that you'll find under reactions in Zoom. And if you can't do that, we'll have you just type in. So Vance, thanks again. And let's begin by, tell us about your background. How did you actually get into the disaster field to begin with?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jim. And thanks for having me come on and the opportunity to talk. I appreciate it. And it's nice. I'm looking through the participant list. I see a lot of friends, which is fantastic. So yeah, in terms of how I got into disaster, it's kind of interesting. So for starters, I'm a California native. I was born in the Bay Area. I lived in Sonoma County. I was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy when I was 7. I've used a power chair for most of my life. After high school, I actually went out of state for college. And then came back to California. And my plan was to do grad school here, which I did for a year. And then I stopped to get some more work experience. And I moved across the country to DC, which why not? Of course, I didn't know a single soul there, but thought somehow it was a good idea to move 3,000 miles away. And I interned for a member of Congress. And I had enough money to stay for 3 months. So that was my plan, was that I would stay for 3 months. And then a month and a half in, I got offered a permanent position. And so I thought, well, I'll do this for a year, then come back to California. And I blinked and 13 years had passed. I found myself having to work for 2 different members of Congress. And I directed security policy at a trade association, and I was a partner at a consulting firm that specialized in emergency management and homeland security. I'd gotten a master's in homeland security and done all this stuff. Now, none of it was ever, I think, deliberate, right? And that I didn't move to DC to get into emergency management. But what happened is during those first few jobs on the Hill, I was handling immigration issues. And after 9/11, immigration moved away from things like H-1B visas, and it skewed more towards homeland security, which was, how do we keep terrorists from coming across the border and entering the country? And the more I got into homeland security, I just loved it. I just found my passion. But I dove in head first. I worked, my boss was on the Homeland Security Committee and gave me free reign to just kind of play, and it was fantastic. Now, Hurricane Katrina hit, and it was a real wake-up call on 2 fronts. One, that this whole notion of homeland security, which was really based around guns, guards, gates, it didn't account for Mother Nature. Right. So it was this wake-up call that you can't just prepare and plan for things like terrorist attacks. You have to take an all hazards approach. And you can't buy risk down to 0. And it led me to emergency management, because what we saw after Katrina was, okay, whether it's a terrorist attack or whether it's a hurricane, if you're down, you're down. Right. So emergency management is all about, well, how do you plan for that, and how do you rebuild? How do you get back? How do you get the community back online? And so it was less about, what was the driver of the event, and more about the consequence associated with the event. And so I became really fascinated with that. And of course, as somebody with a disability, I've got a certain lived experience, which gives me a perspective, right? We all have a perspective based on our own experience. It wasn't hard for me to spot these huge gaps in the way that we as a nation were historically planning, preparing, responding, and recovering from disasters. That people were being left out, that people with access to emergencies didn't have a voice or a seat at the table. and that you had a lot of good people that were trying to do a lot of good things. But June, they didn't know what they didn't know. The easiest example that I give of that is, they'd say, well, hey, we're going to get info out. We'll do a press conference. And nobody stopped to consider the fact that the messages going out, this life-saving information, would in some instances literally fall on deaf ears. So there was no ASL interpreter. Nobody stopped to consider that when you point to an evacuation map and say, go here for safety, that if you're blind or have low vision, that you can't process that. That doesn't mean anything to you. We saw it with evacuation, that there were not accessible vehicles. We saw it with shelters, that there weren't wraparound services. And so looking at how do we address that on a policy level, on a legislative level, at the state and local level, became something of great interest to me. And that partnered up with what I had done on the Homeland Security side is kind of what got me to where I am. So I was in DC and found out about the appointment here in California, and then moved 3,000 miles away with my wife and our 2 daughters and our 2 puppies and our minivan. And that was just about 8 years ago. So I guess you never know, right?
Wow, that's kind of a very rich background. I never asked you that question before. So moving on, so you've been here 8 years. Tell us about the position that you have, your responsibilities in California, your staff, the purpose of what you do, your funding, and the history of your office.
All right. I'm not sure I'm going to remember each one of those, but you can bring up whatever I leave out, all right?
Sure, no problem.
So first, the actual position itself. The position, there were a lot of bites that got taken at this apple. Especially after Katrina, there was this national focus and some attention on the fact that there are inequities within the emergency management system, right? That there were gaps. And California recognized that it wasn't just during major incidents and events that you saw this disproportionate impact on the AFN community, but it was during every incident, no matter how big or small. And California wanted to get out ahead of this. At the same time, there had been some lawsuits that had happened nationally, but also in the state, where these inequities were highlighted in court cases and court rulings. And there didn't seem to be a clear mechanism outside of the legislative process and the judicial process for the community to really have much input or say into the emergency management process. And so groups like the California Foundation of Independent Living Centers and others within California, and we're fortunate that in the state we've got a well-organized community, really spoke to the need to have a representative that could speak to the needs of the community within the state's emergency management system. So all those factors kind of came together, and the governor created the Office of Access and Functional Needs and placed a gubernatorially appointed senior level executive whose responsibility is to brief the governor and the director on these issues. And the mission of the office is really twofold. But the first part is to identify what are the needs that all Californians have before, during, and after disaster. And then it's how do you, in coordination and partnership with the community and emergency management, how do you integrate those needs throughout every facet of the way we plan, prepare, respond, and recover? And so it's a tall order, but it's something that over time, I think we've been able to be very effective in building on the work and getting to a place where we've created a cultural shift that's occurred within emergency management, that instead of being an afterthought, but AFN integration, partnership with the community, work with the CBOs, focusing on the inequities and building these bridges to fill gaps, is now at the forefront of these conversations. Which I'll say this, Jim, and you've seen that there's been tremendous progress, and I'm proud of the role that we've played in that. But that's not to say that we're there, right? There's still a lot of really good work to be done. And as we go through the process, we'll do that together. What else did you ask about? You asked about my team?
Yeah, tell us about your staff, the funding. People are really interested about how the office gets funded and any other history related to the office.
Sure. So in terms of staff, very fortunate to have grown. When I first got here, we were ultimately a staff of one. We then went to like 1.5. Then we brought on more individuals, and now we're, I think, up to 11, because we just got approval for 2 more positions. And so it's fantastic, right? We've been able to have, and there's different categorizations, and I don't want to lose people on the details, but things like program managers, and people to handle language service contracts, and we've got like a digital accessibility coordinator, and we've got people that specialize in plan development, and so we've been able to build out, which is fantastic, because the more we do, of course, the more bandwidth we need. And so our hope is to continue to grow. In terms of funding, most of our budget comes from EMPG grants. So those are federal dollars that go to the states, and then get supplemented through general funds.
That's it. On the budget side, your funding side, would you say EMPG, what percentage of support comes from EMPG as compared to the state general funds?
Most of our positions are funded through EMPG, and at Cal OES, a big chunk of our positions and our programs are funded through EMPG funds. And then it always varies. I think for us, it's a lot of, I don't want, what's the shuffle game, right? Where you move all the pieces around. So depending on what happens with the EMPG funding from a year-to-year basis, then we have to find a way to bring in other funds from other areas. As an agency, Cal OES has grown tremendously. In my almost 8 years here, we've probably grown by more than half. And that's, I think, due to a few things. One is we've seen almost an exponential increase in the number of disasters we face. So to give you a perspective on that, in the 12 years before I got here, I think we had like 4 major presidential declared disasters. And in my first 5 years, I think we had hit like 15. And I think we're over 20 now. So that shows the huge uptick. Not just, again, not just in the number of disasters, but in the scope and scale and devastation associated with those events. Right? I mean, I think, and everybody online can just think for themselves, it used to be that disasters going to happen to other people. Right? We watch on the news as other communities were impacted. But if we were to ask for people to indicate with the hands up feature, how many of you have been impacted in some form or fashion by a disaster or an emergency in the last 5 years, I think virtually every hand would go up. Right? You've either evacuated because of a fire warning or an actual wildfire. You've been impacted likely by air quality from wildfires. You've been impacted by an earthquake or a flood or an atmospheric river or COVID or any number of other events. And so it's no longer about, oh, this happens to other people, right? It's accepting the reality that if we, particularly as people with disabilities or accessing functional needs, if we want to maintain our level of independence, whatever level that is, within the community, we have to think about more than just sort of those standard traditional items about employment and transportation, support from care attendants, other things. We also have to think about managing and navigating the emergency risk landscape. If people on this call aren't signed up to receive emergency alerts, then they're behind the 8 ball. If they don't have a personal evacuation plan in place, then when disasters strike, they're going to be in a very precarious and dangerous spot. We, I think, as a community, have done a good job of saying, hey, as people with these lived experiences, we're very used to navigating complexities. Right? We're really good at seeing these barriers and figuring out ways over, through, or around them. And now we're doing that when it comes to emergency management. And that's a wonderful thing, because that, I think, ultimately translates in decreased human suffering and decreased loss of life.
So, Vance, many of us have heard you talk about your work in the EOC, the Emergency Center, and you've spoken about a priority populations task force, or maybe it's an access and functional needs task force. I'm not sure what the name of it is, but what is it? It seems to be new. what's the role and what's the impact?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few things here. One then is that you see that there's sort of this natural evolution of the emergency management process, right? That maybe we did things one way, but then we've evolved to do things a different way. And you've seen it and you're going to continue to see it. One of the things that we've evolved towards recently has been standing up these task forces. And so if you're reading our situational stat updates or the reports that are going out, you're seeing different task forces get stood up. And basically what we're doing is organizing subject matter experts from relevant agencies or organizations into a joint element, right? And then we call that a task force. Now, the idea there is that they'll work in a coordinated fashion to leverage resources or assets that come from across the state in support of a specific incident or missions associated with operational activities. So when we were looking at last summer, this heat dome that we had, there was a real recognition that if you rely on power for climate control, and you have other needs with assistive technologies or devices, durable medical equipment, that you're going to be at particularly high risk by heat dome, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we were working in partnership with each county on things like, do you have a way to evacuate people? Or can you provide services, transportation services that are accessible to and from cooling centers? And so we stood up what we at that time called an Access and Functional Needs Task Force to really drill down on those issues. It went very well. We certainly learned a lot from it. And then we fast forward to January of this year, and we end up with these floods, these atmospheric rivers in January. And so we stood up that task force again, except for we didn't call it the Access and Functional Needs Task Force. We changed the name to Priority Populations Task Force. And again, the purpose of the Priority Populations Task Force really is to coordinate all state resources to identify and address unmet needs. It's to close gaps, ensure that there's a comprehensive operational preparedness and response that supports Californians at highest risk during these disasters and events. So populations that we're looking at include individuals who are homeless or unsheltered, people with visible and non-visible disabilities, people who have, really any sort of health-related consideration, and people in medical and non-medical congregate facilities. So, as a task force, it was about, hey, how do we develop and disseminate or amplify consistent, inclusive messaging, right? We want people to know what's coming, how to prepare, the best steps to ensure their health and well-being, how do we convene local and county government agencies and entities, oftentimes to provide them with technical assistance on engagement or assistance related to priority populations. How do we evaluate resource requests that come in? How do we look at the way that community-based organizations are being leveraged? So that went for January, those January storms. They went well. Again, we learned more. We started up again in March. And now we've got it, it's continues to be stood up and is working more on the recovery side, because that's an area we don't spend enough time talking about. People think, well, the floodwaters, they recede and it's all good. Well, it's not the case, right? I mean, you still got debris removal. People still need to have a place to live. People have issues with mold. There's how do you connect people with federal resources, state services? And then we're also focused in on what I think has been come to call it the big melt, right? That's what we're all waiting for here in the Tulare Basin. And Mono County and San Bernardino, with all that snow. So there's no shortage of work to be done, but the task force is engaged on those fronts.
So Vance, is it kind of fair to say that it is a kind of a flexible response mechanism that, in a way, if people understand how the Emergency Operations Center is set up, it kind of transcends the work or complements the work in a different way of the Department Operations Centers, because it brings together lots of expertise combined in one task force. That's fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, interesting. Well, that's sounds like a model practice in development, work in progress.
Yes.
Wow, that's cool. I like that. All right. Well, in terms of your, I know there's been legislation in California that charges your office with reviewing California's county emergency plans. Can you talk about that legislation and the process and how you see the impact?
Yeah. So, one of the things that we've got, our legislature has been very proactive on addressing access and functional needs. And, part of that, I think, stems from the fact that as communities get hit, people are impacted, they share with their legislators, hey, here's what's going on, and legislators see it, they feel it, they experience it, and so they come up with ways to address these needs that come up. And so they've come forward with legislation, and then that legislation gets built on, right? And it gets expanded. So let me give you just an example on that front. Assembly Bill 2311 went through, I want to say, in 2016. And that bill said, hey, when a county is updating its emergency operation plan, it needs to integrate access and functional needs within the communication section, the evacuation and transportation section, and the sheltering section. And it talked a little bit about some of the specific components that should be addressed in each of those sections. And that was good, right? That was good to call that out. But then Assembly Bill 477 went through, and that was 2 years or 3 years later. That was in 2019. Yeah, so 3 years later that went through. And what that bill said was, when your county is updating these sections, you can't do it in a vacuum, right? You can't just go into an office with your local emergency management team, build out these sections and call it good. You have to have individuals from the access and functions community included as a part of your update process. And that was a real game changer, because a lot of counties, and look, there's 58 different counties, which means 58 different kind of ways of doing things sometimes. Some counties have really great relationships with their AFN stakeholders. CBOs, they're doing a great job there. Others really struggle with it, right? Some are asking, hey, we don't know who these partners are that we're supposed to be working with. And so it forced them to identify those partners and to come together around the same planning table. And when we see people around the same table, I mean, June, it's to the point now where you can basically drop me off anywhere in the state in the middle of a disaster, and I can tell you in very short order, without having seen their emergency operation plan, if they used an integrated process or not. Because the difference in response and recovery is night and day. And I always tell people that it's one thing to have legislation that says you have to do this. It's another thing entirely in practice that it's not always easy. I think that some jurisdictions have really struggled with the fact that there's a lack of trust between the community and the emergency management team. But once everybody gets to the table, what I say is that expression that it's hard to hate people up close, right? Once we're at the table and we get to know each other, and we see that we've got a shared vision, that we're kind of working to the same end. Maybe one person stops seeing the other one as, oh, this crazy activist, and the other one stops seeing them as, oh, this emergency manager just wants to box me out, and they start working together, and ultimately build a better product. And it's a product that not only does a better job of addressing the needs of the community as a whole, but it's a product that the stakeholders can buy into and sign off on. And so what you have is a lot less about, some incident happens, and look, there's no such thing as a perfect plan, right? Every incident is so unique, and there's so many dynamic and moving parts that it's not uncommon to find a gap. But what you have now is communities that used to say, your plan failed us, who now say, our plan needs to be updated to address this gap. And that move away from your plan and moving towards our plan is huge, right? It's huge. So that's where we see a lot of success. Now, after that bill went through in 2019, a few others passed, and then in 2021, Assembly Bill 580 went through. And Assembly Bill 580 now requires all jurisdictions, county, upon the update of its plan, to submit it to Cal OES. And Cal OES goes through and checks each section. Now on the comms and evacuation and transportation and sheltering sides, my office has a chance to review those.
Vance,
And
comms is communication, right?
Correct, yeah. And
Interesting.
and what we're looking for in there is to ensure that the county is really well aligned with not just what's legally required, but also best practices. Right? That's what we're looking for now, is to say, hey, where are you on these areas? And how can we support you? So, you know, we'll look through and we'll see, hey, did you have a active emotional needs type of group that worked with you on this process? Right? If so, who was on it? How often did you meet? What did that integration piece look like? If we're looking at emergency communication, we're checking things like, is your emergency alert and warning system accessible? Right? Do your alerts include updates in ASL? Or is there alternative text if there's images? Are you able to provide services in a way that ensure that everybody in the community can understand those messages, which is so important, right? Are your social media posts updated in ways that everybody can access them, right? Things like that. On the evacuation section, it's, hey, not only do you have agreements in place with local providers that can help people get out, but do you have agreements in place with surrounding jurisdictions? Because we know more people are going to need a ride than there are vehicles to send. And we do that on sheltering too, looking at wraparound service, right? Is your shelter not just physically accessible, but is it programmatically accessible too? I mean, recognizing that during an event, it's very likely going to be the case that somebody's going to show up with other support network. They might need help with feeding and toileting and transferring in and out of cot. Are you set up to accommodate that? And then we have sort of a two-step thing. Like, one is the county can just say, please review it, in which case we do. And we provide, and we also work with a team of AFN stakeholders to review that, as you well know, Jen. And we'll provide recommendations to the county about, okay, here's what we like, and here's areas you should look at. And here's specific recommendations. Or a jurisdiction can say, we want to work with you through an AFN consult, in which case we set up a 2-hour meeting and we walk and talk through every single point, and then provide them a list of recommendations that they need to get everything aligned.
Hey, Vance,
So
do you get
it's a
any
process.
sense of, what percentage of the reviews that you've done where counties are actually asking you for that important 2-hour access and functional needs consult? Any idea so far?
Gosh, so that's a good question. Let me see. I'm trying to do some quick math in my head because we just started doing these.
Mm-hmm.
I would say over half of the ones that we've gotten have asked for a consult.
Hey, Vance, Beck had a question here. I'm going to read it to you from chat.
Yeah,
from
real quick,
Dale
Jim,
McIntyre.
we've had 12 requests, not 12 requests. We've had 12 counties submit their plans.
Okay,
Of those 12, 7 requested consults.
so you're right on target. A little more
Yep.
than half. Okay. Interesting. Beck Levin from the Dale McIntyre Center asked, what would you say to the government employees and emergency managers who are unwilling to be flexible and are tight-lipped on mitigation plans?
Let me see, what would I say to government employees?
Yeah, I'll read that again. And as I read it, the rest of you, feel free to put your questions in chat because I can ask Vance questions for the next decade. So, yeah, the question is, what would you say to the government employees and emergency managers who are unwilling to be flexible and tight-lipped on mitigation plans?
I mean, I tell them that there's a tidal wave that's coming, and they can either get out of the way or they can be, standing at the front of it when it hits. But the cultural shift that has occurred is real. The legislation that's been passed outlines specific mandates, and they're not in a position that maybe they were. I'm thinking if they're maybe the old school type, they're not in that position anymore where they can afford to be inflexible, where they can afford to not partner, where they can afford to ignore the needs of the community. Culturally, legally, policy-wise, that shift has happened. So anyone of that mindset needs to change that mindset, or I think that they're looking at a limited number of days to remain in that position. Does that mean that everyone is necessarily a champion on these issues? No, it doesn't. But on the empowerment side, there's been a lot of movement and a lot of progress. The mere fact that if there's a county or a jurisdiction that's not willing to move, that we can call up and say, hey, what's going on? I think, helps to encourage and helps to move what needs to be moved to get where we got to get.
So Vance, okay, that tsunami is upon us. Okay. Listen, another question I get a lot, or I've gotten a lot, is for you to talk for a bit about what's your advice regarding other states that want to, that are looking to put in place a position, creating a position like yours? What's your advice as they consider this? What would you say? What steps, etc.?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think about this on a couple of fronts. So on the emergency management side, as an agency, we've grown so much because this office was created. I think as an agency, this office has done a very good job to help the agency understand and really hone in on the fact that, this is the most human thing we do. That emergency management is about the individual. And when we think about people in our lives who we love, that maybe have an access or a functional need, or we think about ourselves as individuals with access or functional needs, what wouldn't we do to ensure the life safety of somebody we loved? And helping, this office has helped each branch, division, and directorate better understand how the work they do directly impacts the individuals that we serve. And so there's benefit on that side. I think on the other side, it's understanding how the community can help support, right? It's immensely helpful for our communications team to have partners throughout the state with community-based organizations that can amplify messaging, right? We talk about hard to reach communities. June, it's not that we live under a rock, right? We're reachable, but a lot of times emergency management doesn't know how to reach the individual. But who's really great at reaching the community? It's the organizations that serve the community. So I know that if I get information to DREDIF or Disparities California or CFILC or the Disaster Coalition and say, please push this out, that the water will get to the end of the row. And there's a big difference between, I think, somebody getting an email that says, oh, Cal OES versus the independent living center that I know and trust, right? The independent living center that has credibility with me. We know that the success of our messaging goes up as we push it through trusted sources. We know that sheltering operations that bring in fast teams, that bring in members of the ILC, that bring in AFN stakeholders to assess the site, to go cot by cot to address AFN needs, that provide resources through loan closets, that help us understand where to get the assets needed to serve the sheltering community. All of that is time and work and resources that no longer have to be expended by the emergency management team, right? So it's a huge lift. So I tell all emergency management agencies, especially in other states, if you don't have an Office of Access and Functional Needs, then you're doing more work than you should be doing, right? That you're missing out. The other thing is, it's not always on the emergency management side that these decisions get made, right? A lot of times it's on the community side. So I would hope that the community in every state would come together to share some bullet points on the importance of having this type of an office, and that as they interact with leadership in those states, that they share those bullet points. We need every state to have a senior level executive that's at the table and in the room when decisions are being made.
So Vance, I think you just kind of answered this next question. We're going to ask it to you. Anyways, with your at the table and in the room. So the question is from Daryl Shaper, who asked, would organizations be better served by having an agency like yours, i.e., as a consulting group to emergency planning versus having individuals with disabilities actually as emergency planner?
So, and thanks, Daryl, for the question. Appreciate that. Let me speak to the way we are set up here at OES. So we've got the Office of Access and Functional Needs, but one of the, we've also got a planning division, right? Planning, Preparedness, Prevention Directorate. So when a plan gets developed, what I can tell you is that if the individual who's actually typing on the keyboard has a lived experience within the AFN world, that initial draft will be much further along by the time it hits my desk than it will if the individual doesn't have that lived experience. What we try and facilitate is, as a plan gets developed, we want the planners, we want the Office of Access and Functional Needs, and we want community representatives to work collaboratively as every word gets written. But if we're truly going to integrate the emergency management system, we can't just hang our hat on the fact that we've got the Office of Access and Functional Needs. If we're really going to integrate emergency management, then we need to see emergency managers at every level that have disabilities, that have access and functional needs. The more diverse we become, the more we do, the more bases we cover, the more perspectives that are at that table. It all serves to enable us to see a larger picture. So it's on both fronts. That, yeah, you want internally, you want to have an office that's their mission, that's what they do. But I think you also have the clear recognition that this shouldn't just be, okay, well, when disabled people come on board, we stick them in the Office of Access and Functional Needs. No, I want to look around across the agency and see people like me everywhere. And we should do that. And by the way, June, let me just say, we talk so much now about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? But you know what often gets left out of that conversation? People with disabilities, right? And I love there's that campaign that talks about if it doesn't include disability, it's not diversity, right? In the same way that we focus on,
Say that one more time, Vance. Say that campaign is about what?
There's a campaign and it says something to the effect of, if it doesn't include disability, it's not diversity. It's not diversity if it doesn't include disability. Because usually when you hear about diversity, you're talking about a specific focus on people of color, on women, on the LGBTQ community, which are all very important. But the fourth pillar there needs to be people with disabilities. And it's, I think oftentimes people will say implied, but it needs to be specifically called out. I can't overstate how important that is. I mean, Gene, just to give you an idea, I'll tell you, and I know this isn't emergency management specific, but I'll tell you the same story. Probably most of the people on this call can tell you. So I grew up, and I remember my mom always saying, hey, just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you can't achieve your dreams, right? You can be successful. You can professionally and personally do whatever you want to do. And I remember very much wanting to believe that. But it was also difficult because I didn't see people like me doing those things. I didn't see a lot of people with disabilities having professional success or moving through the educational system, or even, having success on to whatever that looked like on their social side. But one of the things that I've tried to do is speak to different youth groups of students with disabilities. And I love being able to say, hey, you can do these things. And I know you can do them because I was able to do these things. And if I can do it, believe me, you can definitely do it. When I was on Capitol Hill, it was difficult, right? Everything about it was difficult. And especially somebody with a disability, it was especially difficult because I felt like I had to work twice as hard just to be given the same treatment, if you will, as somebody that could produce. And I had to get up a lot earlier because it takes me longer to get ready in the mornings. And care attendants and transportation and all that stuff. As people with disabilities, we often have to work harder than our non-disabled counterparts. And I was feeling a little down one time, and I was lost in thought, and I was rounding the corner in the Cannon House office building, and I rounded the corner. I came in a little hot, and I went bam, smack right into this other wheelchair that was coming around the corner. And the person that I ran into, it's a gentleman named Jim Langevin, who at the time was the only other member of Congress, that used a power wheelchair. And I thought, great, we got one guy, and I just ran into him. But Jim took time, asked me who I was. And then he said, I want you to come see me. And every couple months, Jim would call me into his office. And he began to mentor me. And it was him that said, you got to go to grad school. And it was him that said, all right, you got to get off the hill now. Go make money. Pay your bills. He was a great mentor. But it was the first time that I could ever look and say, hey, if Jim could do this, then I can do this, right? It's possible. So going back to the original question, when we go back to our organizations, if you see people with disabilities at that organization, especially at the leadership level, the message that sends to anyone coming in is that you are valued here, you are welcome here, and you'll be given the same opportunity to succeed as your non-disabled counterparts, and your perspective is valued at this agency. So, yeah, we need to be integrated throughout the agency.
On that note, Brian asked, we all ask this question, how do we get more people with disabilities into this field? Sometimes we think we're the weird few advocates who attend to some of this stuff, and it's a difficult recruit for some of us to widen the net and the interest.
Yeah, I think, Jim, a lot of it's we talk about it, right? I mean, the fact is that we don't do enough on the job development and job recruiting that we should for any field, let alone emergency management. And so I think that what we got to do is we got to do a better job of letting youth, of letting college students, of letting people know that, hey, this is the field, here's what we do, we need your voice, and you can contribute on this. This is something you should be a part of. And that'll help a lot, but we can't use the same tactics and hope to get a different response. We got to be more proactive at getting out there.
Well, yeah, we all have responsibility to try and help with that, to mentor with that. Vance, moving maybe more to the trenches here, but you did mention it before. A lot of us and a lot of listeners are struggling with the specifics regarding disaster evacuations and transportation. Are there any good practices out there that you could share that makes this part of the planning more real, more specific, more operational?
Yeah, I think the first thing, June, is to accept that difficult reality that no one's coming to get you, right? We have this idea, because there's an app for everything, right? That, well, I'm on a list somewhere, or somebody knows, or I'll just call 911. We have this notion that when I call for help, somebody's just going to come. And it doesn't work that way in emergency management, not usually. We have to put a plan in place for ourselves. We have to take ownership over this, because no one's going to do it for you. I will say on the government side, look, government has a responsibility to stretch, to do more, right? To try to get as much help out there in terms of assets and resources as possible. But there will never be enough assets or resources to meet the needs of every individual. It's just a numbers game. It doesn't add up. So we need to have a personal evacuation plan, for example. I got to have a system in place that enables me to get out safely. And most of that can be done if you just think through the process. We always talk about go 5 people deep, right? Think of 5 people in your support network that you can call for help, coordinate with them on the front end. We know that it's not realistic to think that all 5 people are going to be available to help you at a moment's notice, but that the hope is that one of the 5 would be available. And I know that there's a lot of variability when it comes to the extent or the degree to which people can prepare. All I would say is, to the extent that you can prepare, do that. Right? Do everything on your end that's possible for you to do, so that you're as prepared as you can be. Like I said earlier, if you're not signing up for emergency alerts, I mean, part of that is we got to know right now, right? If there's an event, I don't have the luxury of waiting to find out about it, because it takes me longer to evacuate than it takes most people. Right? If you got to pack up your durable medical equipment, if you got to figure out care attendant support, if you got to figure out transportation, that all just takes time. So you want that emergency alert because you want to know right now. When you set up your emergency plan, you got to do all that stuff. Go ahead.
There's no question that what you're saying is supremely important, that there will never be enough resources, that our plans, they'll have to be there. We can't have, magical thinking about this, that you're going to send the Black Hawk helicopter to get me. But there is still question about the plans that people do see regarding evacuation and transportation just seem very non-specific and weak. Everything you're saying is true on the individual side, but on the plan side, on the local county or city or jurisdiction side, how can we help to make these plans more specific, looking at the assets, coordinating, it just doesn't seem to be working well.
June, it's a good question. And what I would say is that, like everything else we've talked about, there's an evolutionary process here, right? As we're looking, as Cal OES, for example, is reviewing these county EOPs, and we're looking at transportation, we're asking questions that a lot of jurisdictions haven't considered, right? When we ask, okay, do you have contracts in place right now with transportation providers within your county? A lot of them don't, right? A lot of it's like, oh, well, when that happens, I call Steve. Okay, that's great, but what if Steve's on vacation? What if you're on vacation? Right? They're based on relationships. And so what we're saying is you need contracts in place. So it doesn't matter if somebody retires or moves or is gone, that contract is there. Then we're saying, hey, recognize that one contract's not going to cover all the bases. To set up contracts with the counties that surround your jurisdiction, because you need surge capacity, right? You're going to have to pull in those resources from outside entities in order, or agencies, counties, to supplement what you've got. But then the other thing we talk about is, okay, but then let's say you got these contracts in place. How do I know how to leverage that? Right? How do I, as an individual, know that access that. And so we're telling each county, come up with a standard operating procedure. Because June, you've seen these, right? Happen where it's like, okay, for the heat dome, if you need evacuation systems, call this number. And then there's a fire, and it's like, well, for the fire, it's a different number, or it's a website, or you send a text. And then for the flood, we've got another option. So no, come up with one standard procedure that when somebody with access to water needs emergency evacuation services, they use that to get the service. We are really good at knowing how to get EMS or firefighters or police, right? We call 911. That's socialized with us. We've known it since we were young. But we should also be socializing the number to call to get emergency evacuation assistance. And the fact is, most counties can't provide that because they don't have one set up. And so we're working with them on that front. And so what you're going to see now is that that's going to be the best practice, right? And as an established best practice, and others will shift and pivot to meet that. But again, this is all part of the evolution. And so while I'll repeat what I said when we first started talking, which is there's been a lot of progress. We've come a pretty far way, but we're not there yet, right? Once we get this stuff taken care of, then guess what? There's going to be more stuff to do. But it's sort of this process that you got to do one before you can do the other. But we're going to continue to push. And for me, it's really helpful to talk to you. It's really helpful to talk to our state AFN advisory committee. It's really helpful to be in close partnership with community-based organizations, because you continue to say, look, here's where we are, here's where the gaps are, here's what's coming. And it feeds our process, it feeds what we're doing. At the same time, it also enables me to tell you, here's what we're doing, or here's why that is or is not being addressed. So here's how we're going to try and tackle it. And here's the support that we need. And so it very much comes down to that saying that you've probably heard me say a million times now, which is ultimately, as a community, we will succeed or we will fail, but we'll do it together, right? We're no longer at a place where, well, one person can make it, the other okay. No, we're all in this together. And as communities, we need to come together in an integrated form and fashion to ensure that we all get there.
Thank you so much, Vance. I think that was very beautifully said. And I just want to go ahead and thank everyone for their thoughts and participations down in the chat. With that, it looks like our time is coming to an end. I'm going to go ahead and launch a brief poll with just a couple of questions on it. Please take a moment to complete it. We do ask for your honest feedback. June also in the chat went ahead and put in her email. If you have any suggestions for future meetings, please feel free to reach out to her directly. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.
And thanks to you, Vance. This was a pretty wide-ranging and rich discussion, and I know, like I can go on for a lot longer. I learned a lot. I hope others did as well. There's so many buckets and pathways to explore here. It's always a work in progress, and this is very very helpful in terms of thinking about some of the new good practices that you're pursuing, and I hope that in the future we can explore those even more. So thanks a
Thanks,
lot
Jen.
for doing this. I'm glad I was able to tear you away from all you've got going right now.
This is where I want to be. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
And urge y'all to answer the poll question, please, and join us next week for our own personal exploration of what is our role on these committees and advisory groups, and how do we hold ourselves and others accountable. Give you a few more minutes to finish the poll, and feel free to email me with your other ideas about topics for these discussions. Thanks again for your participation.
Brian, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. Looks like it was 100% completed.
Well, we have 27 of 27 left. What does that mean, Carla?
27. So
Okay.
when the poll was launched, there were 27
20.
participants, and they have all filled it out.
Okay, even though we had an average of about 40 people on the call, so that's not
Yeah,
bad.
so people tend to kind of hop off towards the end. So about half participation. That's okay.
That's good. Okay, you'll send me that, and will you send me the chat too, please?
Of course, I'm going to go ahead and end this now, since we are live streaming, and I'll email you shortly with all the information.
Thanks so much.